Hi guys, I will post a words messages, an actual message for you about how to take your quiz next week. I'm going to post one more lecture before we have a quiz after today. We'll have one lecture next week and then we'll have a quiz. Betsy's with me again today, sorry. But today we're going to talk about the American founding. Most of you guys probably took AP US history, so you probably already know a lot of this stuff, but I'm going to just go through it really quickly. And as always, please email me if you have any questions. I've heard from a few of you guys that you maybe don't have your textbooks yet. If you don't have them, please email your guidance counselors. I don't have your books. Your schools have them. So reach out to your schools if you don't have your books yet. And let me know if you don't have your books. Oh yeah, Betsy says hi. Okay, so governments depend on the authority of people believing that their power is legitimate, right? So when that legitimacy is challenged, the authority of a government is also. So the book starts out talking about Cliven Bundy, which is a really interesting thing to think about. He had this wildlife refuge in Oregon in 2016 that supported ranchers. They were arrested for arson on federal land, and there were ranchers who didn't support Bundy's group. Bundy demanded that the land be given back to the state, and it was owned by the federal government. There was this whole, they didn't want to have a showdown, but there were various militias involved and whose land it was. But it really reflected, what we're getting at here is it reflected a growing movement that the federal government was abusing the power of the Constitution and that the power must be returned to the citizens. That was what Cliven Bundy's group was about. Another example of this is Timothy McVeigh bombing Oklahoma City in 1995. The Tea Party movement is another example of this, that saying that the federal government is abusing the power of the Constitution and that must be returned to the citizens. How should the federal government respond to challenges of its legitimacy? You know, where do we draw the line between sounding off against an elected official and somebody who advocates for violence to protest? You think about our country, and we were founded on rebels who were protesting their government. So how do we draw that line? When in the English colonies, a lot of British subjects came to America to make money and to practice religion without interference, to become landowners. They began to understand who had power by looking at who had power in the colonies, was to look at who participated in the politics, who was allowed to vote and call in the colonial rulemaking bodies, who was allowed to vote, who wasn't. Each colony had its own voting rules based on religion, property, gender, race. Religion, in the earliest days, the tightest requirements for voting were moral or religious qualifications. The northern colonies wanted to keep the ungodly out of the government. There were religious tests that prevented a lot of people from voting. Property owners. There was a conventional British wisdom that if you were not a property owner, why would you care about the government? So colonies began to think about this too and required voters to be property owners or later taxpayers. Some women could vote. Sometimes in England, if they satisfied the property requirement and if there were no other voting males in their households. So for example, like a widow or a daughter who had inherited property could vote in a church meeting. This was eventually excluded in America after the Revolution and then came about obviously later on. Race, at first African Americans were subject to the same laws as Europeans, but then the need for cheap labor took over and slavery came about. As slavery became accepted, rights of African Americans were stripped, and slavery really, they tried to make slaves dependent and defenseless and afraid to escape. And then there was the split from England. So the relationship of colonial America and England that bound them together was accepted as normal. Americans were obligated to make England their primary trading partner. All goods passed through England where they were taxed. There were benefits. They had the financial support of British corporations, military defense, a secure market for agricultural products. These generally outweighed the burdens of the obligation. Colonists began to really identify, though, as American instead of English transplants. And then they started thinking of the British presence as intrusive. But they tried to fix this really instead of ending it. In 1754, there was the French and Indian War, which was a war fought between France and England. This put the British really deeply in debt. And they turned to the colonies to pay for their defense. They levied taxes on the colonies. They tried to enforce more trade laws to increase British profits from American resources. But the colonies were free of Spanish, French, and Indian threat, and they didn't really need the British protection anymore after this war. And so they could afford to resist the British efforts to make them pay for it. So the Tea Party Act of 1773 was when they hurled the tea into Boston Harbor in the infamous Boston Tea Party. Britain responded by passing the Coercive Acts of 1774, which was designed to punish the citizens of Massachusetts, but this unknowingly sowed seeds of revolution. Colonists rejected British sovereign law in the favor of popular sovereignty, that the government belonged in the hands of the people. The British colonial authority seemed illegitimate, and this was taxation without representation. So popular sovereignty came about, which is the concept that citizens are the ultimate source of political power. After the Boston Tea Party, it was apparent that Americans weren't giving up. In 1774, the First Continental Congress declared the Coercive Acts void. Okay, baby. They planned to stop trade with England, and they called for another meeting next year, but before the meeting, the King's Arm arrested Sam Adams and John Hancock, and Paul Revere roused the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and the revolution began. The Declaration of Independence came about afterwards. Common Sense was the pamphlet written by Thomas Paine in 1776 that supported many Americans to support persuaded many Americans to support the revolutionary cause. It kind of went viral for that time. More than 150,000 copies were sold in just a few weeks, and it called for the rejection of the king, for independence, and for a Republican government. In 1776, the Continental Congress met, and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence from England. Thomas Jefferson was brilliant, and really this document's proof of that. The Declaration of Independence is the political document that dissolved the colonial ties between the United States and Britain. John Locke said the government is based on a contract between the rulers and the ruled. And the ruled have to agree to obey laws as long as the rulers protect their basic rights to life, liberty, and property. And if this fails, they can break up and form a new government. So that's why the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, says property instead of pursuit of happiness, because they thought they could get more people on board with pursuit of happiness instead of pursuit of property. They didn't point fingers at Parliament, but they did share some of the blame. Perhaps they weren't going to form a parliament of their own, but because they also didn't want to recognize the parliament's authority over them, or they did want to have some sort of a parliament of their own, but they also didn't want to recognize Parliament's authority over them. So they really pointed their wrath at King George. Do we think that there would be any circumstances now where it's justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government today, like the way we did against England? That all men are created equal. John Locke explains that equal doesn't necessarily mean equal. Age, virtue, excellency, merit, etc. can change the definition of that. Men are equal in a natural sense, but society establishes dimensions of that where they're unequal. Jefferson actually blamed King George for the institution of slavery in the original draft of the Declaration. He insisted that a man who owned it was interesting because he did own slaves, and he wrote on behalf of many slave owners. It was a very politically confusing and morally ambiguous time, but that passage eventually was deleted. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States in 1777, created an association of states with a weak central government. They set up a firm league of friendship among the 13 states, but they didn't empower a central government or act effectively on their behalves. And so this Articles of Confederation was eventually replaced because they needed a stronger central government. There were thoughts, originally that they didn't want a strong central government because they're trying to get away from that, but then they realized that maybe they did. So a confederation is a government where independent states unite for a common purpose, but they retain their own sovereignty. That's what we tried. It didn't work. It was founded on state authority, but it says nothing about individuals. Yeah. Just a minute, baby. Got everybody home today. There are no rights or obligations for citizens under a confederation. This is all handled by the states. These states are going to be 13 individual independent units. They all had their own currencies, laws, tariffs, and everything there was nothing like national security and general welfare that was kind of over all of them. It was kind of relied on by voluntary goodwill and cooperation of state governments. So there were some winners and some losers under this Articles of Confederation. It was pretty weak. The future of the United States was up in the air, and there was no effective central government, and they couldn't conduct business with other countries. It was difficult. Popular tyranny, that is the unrestrained power of the people. In a monarchy, you fear unrestrained power of the king, but in a republican government, you fear the unrestrained power of the people. So in 1787, Shays' Rebellion happened. It was a grassroots uprising by armed Massachusetts farmers. And this scared and embarrassed leaders of the United States. Their experiment in self-government was really failing at this point. They had to find a way to contain and limit the will of the people in a government that was supposed to be based on the will of the people. It was a really big challenge. So in 1787, there was the Constitutional Convention, where they had 55 delegates that convened to recast the Articles of Confederation. And the result of this was the United States Constitution. The delegates were mostly educated, powerful, and wealthy citizens of the United States. They were really the cream of crop of society. You know, you had George Washington, George Mason, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. These were the cream of the crop, very well educated when most people were not, mostly were young. They were a lot of very politically experienced in revolutionary politics, and they were well read on political theories of the day. So they came up with a compromise. They compromised on what was called federalism. This is a political system that divides power between the central and regional units. Unlike a confederation where the states retain the ultimate power, federalism gives the central government its own source of power. This is the Constitution over the people of the United States, but it also gives independent power to the states. The Federalists are the people who supported the Constitution, and they favored the strong central government. The Anti-Federalists were the advocates of states' rights. They were the ones who favored the Articles of Confederation. They opposed the Constitution. So you kind of had two factions going here, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the people who wanted a strong central government and the people who did not want a strong central government. So they had to decide how they were going to allot power among the states. Should all states be the same? Should the larger ones have more power? So there were two plans about resolving this. The Virginia Plan, you guys know this from U.S. history, I'm sure, but we're going to go over it again. The Virginia Plan was the proposal at the Constitutional Convention that constitutional representation be based on population. So the large states would have more representatives because their state, so like Virginia is a large state, would have more representatives. This was created by James Madison. He wanted to have proposed that the country would have a strong national government run by bicameral, which means two houses, legislature. One house would be directly elected by the people, one elected indirectly by a combination of state legislatures and popularly elected national house. The numbers would be determined by the taxes paid by the residents of the state. The large states would have more representatives in both the houses, and national law would be weighed in their favor because they had more representatives. So there were three large states, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, that could really form a majority and carry any national legislation their own way, and the rest of the other states wouldn't have any say. So that was the Virginia plan, favoring the large states, because Virginia was a large state. The New Jersey plan favored the small states. New Jersey's a small state. It was the proposal that the congressional representation be equal. That favored the small states. This would be a unicameral, which means one house legislature. Each state would only have one vote, and delegates would be chosen by state legislatures. Small states could really block what large states wanted at this point, even though large states had more people and contributed more revenue. So it was really confusing. How should they do this? So we have the Great Compromise. This is the Great Compromise. It's the constitutional solution to congressional representation. Why can't I talk? Equal votes in the Senate and votes by population in the House. So you have one of each. This kept most of the framework of the Virginia Plan. We had strong federal structure headed by a central government with sufficient power to tax the citizens, to regulate commerce, to conduct foreign affairs, and to organize the military and exercise central powers. It called for a single executive, our president, and a national judicial system, our Supreme Court. It provided for two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. That's bicameral, two houses, two houses, bicameral. One is the House of Representatives that would be based on state population. So, for instance, California is a huge state, so it has a lot of representatives. And then you have something like Alaska, that's a tiny state that has very few representatives. So it is based on state representation. It gives large states the extra clout, but in the Senate, every state has two votes. Every state has two senators, no matter what. So there are 435 members of the House of Representatives that are divided among the states. There are only 100 members of the Senate because each state gets two senators. So that gives small states more power in the Senate than in the House. The House is going to be, at this point, the House is elected by the people and the Senate was elected by state legislatures. Now that's different. We elect all of them. Legislation had to be approved by both houses, so neither the large or small states could hold the entire country hostage, and that's still true. Okay, so that's the great compromise on that. Now, we got to discuss how population is to be determined for purposes of representation. Southern states wanted to count slaves, even though they have no intent of giving them the right to vote, but northern states said if a slave could not vote, they shouldn't be counted. So they came up with another compromise, and this is the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise is the formula for counting 5 slaves as 3 people for purposes of representation. This reconciled northern and southern factions at the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so then they have to ratify this. They have these compromises. Now they have to ratify. Ratification is the process by which a proposal is formally approved and adopted by vote. Okay, so you've got your Federalists and your Anti-Federalists, and the Federalists are mostly men with considerable economic stake in the new nation they fared poorly under the Articles. They wanted a strong national government. They wanted security and order and popular control. They thought people like themselves should be in charge. They expanded suffrage a little bit if they could have some protections built in. So they started writing the Federalist Papers. You've probably heard of these. These are a series of essays written to build support for ratification of the Constitution. There was an aggressive media blitz. They hit the New York newspapers with editorials written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They were bound and distributed, and that was how the Federalists were trying to make their points. The Anti-Federalists rejected the notion that ambition and corruption were inevitable parts of human nature. They said if government could be kept small and local, then Americans could be happy without getting involved in politics. They said Americans should not stray from their rural roots and values, and they could avoid creeping corruption that threatened it. So we have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists kind of fighting here. The Federalists want the strong national government. The Anti-Federalists want a weak national government. So the Federalist Papers that advocated for the strong national government were 85 essays. They were well thought out and very logical, but very tricky and persuasive. They said that one of the greatest dangers, Madison in Federalist number 10 tried to convince Americans that a large country was no more likely to succumb to the effects of special interest than a small one, but that the greatest danger came from factions. And factions are groups of citizens united by some common passion or interest, and that opposed the rights of other countries or interests to the whole community. But they thought that factions could really infringe on individual liberty, and so but Madison thought that factions could easily be managed in a large republic, that the representation would dilute their effects. Madison really relied on the mechanical elements of politics, like size and representation, to remedy the flaw in human nature, like to form divisive factions. This is a typical Federalist approach to government. Federalist 84, which was written by Hamilton, and the Constitution was ratified because of it, argued against a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a summary of citizen rights that guarantee and protects a government. It adds to a constitution the first 10 amendments in order to achieve ratification. Some state constitutions had a Bill of Rights, and it was argued that it would be redundant. Anti-Federalists were afraid of the invasive power of a national government, and they were afraid of the omission. You know, they wanted this Bill of Rights to protect against an invasive national government. Remember, they are not in favor of a strong national government. But Hamilton said it was unnecessary. We didn't need a Bill of Rights, and it was dangerous to include them because the limited national government couldn't interfere with citizen lives in many ways, and interference would be suspect. He said if the Constitution was prefaced with a list of things the government could not do, then the government was to assume that they had the power to do anything that wasn't expressly forbidden. So basically he said, if we come up with these things that say the government can't do these things, it means the government can do everything except for those things. Interesting thought. They ended up kind of tailoring them to be more of a bill of limits on federal government, and then they added them as the first 10 amendments. So that was the Bill of Rights, and that was why basically we were able to kind of get everybody on the same page. The final vote, smaller states ratified this Constitution quickly. It was unanimous in Delaware and New Jersey and Georgia. Connecticut and Pennsylvania, strongly in favor. South Carolina, Massachusetts, Maryland. There was only one left for the requisite 9, and then Virginia, New Hampshire, and New York voted in favor. North Carolina defeated it. And Rhode Island didn't even send delegates and wouldn't vote, but later North Carolina and Rhode Island did ratify and join the Union. So citizenship was a fledgling creation at our founding. They weren't subjects of a crown anymore, right? We are not subjects of a monarchy. Citizens have rights and obligations, but citizenship does not confer equal rights. Principle really clashes with prejudice. We can all be appalled at the failure of founders to practice principles of equality, but we really need to remember that citizenship was a new concept for them. What they had created was so much more democratic than anything they'd ever seen before. The purpose of a government really is to protect our rights, and the Constitution guarantees American freedoms of speech and assembly, but the government needs to hold the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in society, or it will fall like the British government fell to American colonies. So we permit legal ways of getting involved. Running for office, voting, changing laws, amending the Constitution. We want to prevent the rise of groups like Cliven Bundy that I started talking about that promotes violence. We want to promote political stability and not revolution. But really, how do we draw the line between protection of an individual right and the exercise of governmental authority? We want to respect the rights of all citizens, but it can be really thwarted when a small number of individuals reject the rules of the game agreed upon by the majority. All right, I do want you guys to respond to me now. I want you to email me how the federal government should respond to challenges against its legitimacy. Do we think there are any circumstances today where it would be justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government? I want you to tell me that. Where do we draw the line between sounding off against an elected official and somebody who advocates for violence at protests? I'm going to go over this one more time. So when we founded our country, we were rebelling against the British. But we don't want people to rebel against our government now. When do we think it would be justifiable now for a group in the United States to rebel against the federal government? When is that justifiable? What are the circumstances? What do you think that would look like for us to have another rebellion the way we did that formed our country now? So email me, annalyrits@gmail.com. What circumstances would it be justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government today? I want you to respond to me by 9 o'clock Friday morning, just like last week. What circumstances today would it be justifiable for groups in the United States to rebel against the federal government today? There's really no right or wrong answer, but I want to know what you think. When do you think it's justifiable to rebel against our government? All right, I will be back early next week with one more lecture, and then I will post some guidelines about how we're going to take our quiz. We will have a quiz at the latter part of next week. All right, have a great weekend, and email me by 9 o'clock Friday morning. Thanks.